Hi, I'm Jared Burns, and you're listening to Stump the Preacher, a podcast where we explore how Christianity and the Bible intersect with our deepest questions and our daily lives. In each episode, I address a submitted question to help you find Bible-based, Christ-centered answers to what's on your mind. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I love helping you search for them. So join me today as we research another question. The question I'd like to address today deals with the trustworthiness of the Bible. If we're going to live our lives according to the Bible, we need to know that it's a book we can trust. One person who wrote their question down for me wanted to know, how do we know the disciples recorded Jesus' actions and words accurately? If the Bible's not trustworthy, then everything we believe just becomes speculation. And so I'll tell you up front as I come to address this question, that I do believe the Bible records Jesus' actions and words accurately. I think the disciples got it right. I think the Gospels got it right. Now, as to the reasons for that, I've heard historians and manuscript experts and other Bible scholars make these long, detailed arguments about why that's the case. But in the next few minutes, just the short time that we have together today, I want to share with you a few simple reasons that I find especially compelling when it comes to the evidence that the Gospels are accurate records of Jesus' life. And unfortunately, we can't hop in a time machine and go back and watch the process unfold. That would be so much easier, but we can't do that, so we have to look for clues from history. And we want to ask, is it even possible that the writers of the four Gospels could have recorded Jesus' life accurately in their accounts? Now, to answer that, we have to start by dealing with the identities of the authors. I think Lee Strobel did a great job of answering this issue in The Case for Christ, but I'm going to take a stab at just a very short answer to it today. Liberal scholars today question the authorship of the Gospels, but there's plenty of reason to believe that Matthew was written by Matthew, that Mark was written by John Mark, that Luke was written by Luke, and that John was written by John. To give you just a couple of reasons why that's true, first, there's the issue of name recognition. Some scholars have rightly argued that if somebody was going to forge an account of Jesus' life, they'd make it sound more authoritative by using a prominent name. You know, John is the only one of the four traditional writers who features prominently in the stories. But Matthew, John Mark, and Luke were not names that carried tremendous weight on their own. So they would be really unlikely choices for pseudonyms if somebody was going to make up these gospel accounts under somebody else's name. But secondly, there's also the testimony of the earliest Christians. The early churches believed nearly unanimously in the traditional authors of the four Gospels. That's why they became the traditional authors. And we see evidence of this early acceptance of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being written by the men that we believe they were in the writings of other men like Papias of Hierapolis, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon. These were early Christian writers who knew what they were talking about and believed that these four Gospels were written by the four men whose names they bear. And the people who lived in their time, the people of these early churches, the people who knew these four men, the people who knew the associates and followers of these four men, they held to the traditional authorship. They believed that Matthew was written by Matthew, and Mark by John Mark, and Luke by Luke, and John by John. And we can't just chalk that up to their ignorance. There were a lot of other writings, I have to tell you, some of them crazy, that even in the early days of Christianity, most of the churches correctly discarded as forgeries, regardless of whose name was on it. So with all due respect to the modern skeptics, I'm going to defer to the earliest Christians, to the ones who knew firsthand who wrote what, and I believe there's every reason, based on history and based on the testimony of early Christians, to believe that the traditional writers were the actual writers. So with these traditional authors in mind, could they have made accurate recordings of Jesus' life? Well, we know Matthew was a disciple, and that put him there with Jesus daily. Recording Jesus' life accurately would have been a fairly easy task for Matthew. I recently heard someone make the argument that as a Roman tax collector, Matthew would have been trained in detailed record keeping, including a kind of shorthand. He could have written things down word for word in real time. It would have been a simple task for him. And John, too, was a disciple. In fact, he was a part of Jesus' inner circle along with Peter and James. He would have been an eyewitness to even more things than Matthew would have been. And it certainly would have been possible for John to compile an accurate record of Jesus' life because he was there for almost everything during Jesus' earthly ministry. John, Mark, and Luke are a little different, though, as writers. They weren't among the 12 disciples. They weren't eyewitnesses to everything they record. As a matter of fact, they may not have been eyewitnesses to any of it. So we have to ask, where did their information come from if that's the case? Now, the Bible tells us that John Mark was dismissed by the Apostle Paul from one of his missionary journeys, which led to a rift between Paul and Barnabas. So again, John Mark would not have been a smart forger's first choice for a pseudonym. But history also tells us that after that, John Mark became a close associate of the Apostle Peter. And a lot of evidence from history and from the biblical text itself leads us to conclude that John Mark acted as a kind of scribe or editor for what was ultimately Peter's account of the life of Jesus. And Peter, like John, would have known more about the life of Jesus than just about anyone else. Now, Luke was a close associate of the Apostle Paul, and his work was a little bit different even from John Mark's. He was a highly educated man for his time. He was a doctor, he had an analytical mind, and as the only non-Jewish writer in the Bible, he set out to help his Gentile readers understand Jesus. And so Luke went around collecting eyewitness testimony and meticulously checking details and assembling it all into an orderly account. Now, his introduction in Luke 1:1-4 says, "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed." There's plenty of reason to believe that the Gospels were written by the authors they're traditionally attributed to. There's plenty of reason to believe that those men were thoroughly knowledgeable about the life of Jesus and capable of writing an accurate account. And there's plenty of reason to believe that that's just what they intended to do. Still, even if these Gospels were written by the right men with the right abilities and the right motives, some people continue to worry about potential errors creeping into the text. What was there to stop them from making mistakes? Now, we just need to remember their culture was largely oral. Things were passed down by word of mouth, and in general, that made memory a lot more important to them than it is today. Even with stories and poems, people committed them to memory, and the community would correct a storyteller if he got the details wrong. And there's manuscript evidence that shows these Gospels were written within a generation or less of Jesus' earthly ministry. So if inaccurate stories began circulating, there were plenty of eyewitnesses who could have spoken up and corrected any errors in any of the details. So the type of oral culture they had and the presence of the eyewitnesses, those don't really leave room for errors, or they would have been corrected or the writings just discarded like so many others were because of their inaccuracies. And so we need to look finally at what is written in the Gospels. Does the overall pattern of what we find in the Gospels point toward accuracy or toward fabrication? Focus for a moment on the historical details. Do the Gospels really read like fairy tales, the ones that start out once upon a time in a land far, far away? No, they don't sound like that at all. The Gospels are full of references to places and times and people that can be checked. You can evaluate all these details for accuracy, and a huge number of these details have been evaluated and verified. And that points to the conclusion that these men took every precaution to prepare accurate historical records of the life of Jesus. But there's one final point that I find particularly compelling, and it's the presence of what I call the inconvenient parts of the Gospels. You know, if someone were going to fabricate parts of the story in which he was a character, one of the things he would do is add some details that make him look good, or at least omit some of the details that make him look bad. People don't typically lie or fabricate to make themselves look worse. Yet the disciples, those eyewitnesses who wrote Matthew and John, and those eyewitnesses who contributed to Mark and Luke, they don't look so great in the story. Think about the details. We see throughout the Gospels, the disciples were constantly confused by Jesus' teaching. Sometimes they were just as confused as the Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus called spiritually blind, and the disciples were constantly needing to be corrected. And then you look at some stories in the Gospels and you see just how jealous the disciples looked. You see how pridefully they acted. In one case in particular, they came to Jesus arguing over who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. There were actually multiple occasions when that happened. Even after Jesus had corrected it once, they still came back arguing, wanting to figure out who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. We also see how impatient they were. We see that they didn't have time for the things Jesus was doing. They didn't always have time for spiritual things. As a matter of fact, they come back from purchasing supplies, from gathering provisions, when they're traveling with Jesus through Samaria. And Jesus was sitting there at the well talking to the Samaritan woman. And they came back, and rather than thinking spiritually about what Jesus was doing, they became impatient about the fact that he was spending his time talking to this woman, and they began to try to prod him along. We see that they were often lacking in faith. There was the instance where Jesus came to them walking across the sea. And Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out of the boat." And Jesus commanded him, and Peter stepped out of the boat and began to walk across the water. Now, when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, he began to look at the waves and he began to look at the wind. He began to fear. Ultimately, it means he began to doubt, and he began to sink in the water. He would have been a dead man if Jesus hadn't been there to rescue him. And Jesus called him a man of little faith and asked, why did he doubt? Still, we have to give Peter the credit. At least he had enough faith to step out of the boat, unlike the others. But even in some of his moments of his greatest faith, Peter's faith wavered. And we see numerous instances like that throughout the Gospels where their faith just wasn't as strong as it should have been. We see that they were short-sighted. There's another instance where Jesus was talking about his upcoming crucifixion, and Peter didn't seem to realize that it was God's plan for our salvation, and so he begins to argue and say he'll never let this happen. And Jesus tells him, "Get behind me." He says, you're falling right into Satan's mindset and Satan's plans because you're so focused on the here and now that you can't even see what God's plans are. So we see that Peter was short-sighted all that time with Jesus, and he still didn't understand God's plans. We see that the disciples were often earthly minded. Throughout Jesus' ministry, they were waiting for him as the Messiah to lead a political revolution. They were waiting for him to become the king of the Jews and kick the Romans out. They couldn't see, they couldn't understand even after Jesus explained it to them, that his kingdom was not of this world. We see in the gospel accounts that they were fickle. We see how they denied Jesus. We see Peter in particular denied Jesus 3 times after swearing that he would never deny Jesus. He denied him 3 times, and the final time he was so emphatic that he cursed rather than admit that he even knew Jesus. In the Gospels, we see that the disciples were fearful. They were so afraid that after Jesus was crucified, they went into hiding. And we see that they were filled with doubt, because when the story was first told to them by the women that Jesus had risen from the dead, Peter and John had to go see for themselves. We have to see it with our own eyes before we're going to believe it. And the disciple Thomas famously refused to believe until he saw Jesus in front of him, where he could put his hands in Jesus' wounds. No, they were the eyewitnesses who told the stories behind the gospel records. And yet for so many reasons, they don't look like the heroes of the story. So assume for a minute that the disciples and their associates did change the details in the Gospels. Assume for a minute that they did embellish things or engage in some kind of creative editing to present those stories differently from how they actually transpired. With those assumptions, I struggle to see how all of these inconvenient details make any sense. After all, if you were going to alter the story in any way, would you continue to include this long pattern of details that don't portray you in a very good light? Or would that be the first part of the story you worked on? For me, that's one of the more compelling arguments for believing that the Gospels are an accurate record of the life of Jesus. There's no reason for them to have left all those inconvenient details in their stories unless they were determined to tell the whole thing as it really happened with total accuracy and total transparency. Now, this pattern of inconvenient details tells me that they were meticulous in reporting the stories as they actually were, as opposed to how they wanted them to be. And from my perspective, the evidence shows that the Gospels recorded the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They gave us a shockingly trustworthy account. As John said, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. They wanted us to know the truth because they wanted us to see Jesus for who He really is. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Stump the Preacher. If you have a question you'd like us to consider for a future episode, just visit us online at stumpthepreacherpodcast.com and use our contact form to submit it. You can also find more Bible teaching from me on my website, jaredburns.com, or on my other podcast, Rejoicing in Truth, a daily program available on iTunes, Spotify, and most other podcatchers.